see my screen?
Yes, it's well, yeah.
Okay. How does the situation I described shortly in all these countries translate into the position of the biological father? In my analysis, we will look at his status in 3 different contexts: traditional marriage, medically assisted reproduction, and the same-sex marriage. Let me start with traditional marriage. Well, a legal valid marriage has a powerful influence on family relations. For example, through the presumption of paternity, which determines a child's legal father. Both the Polish, German, and the Swiss legal systems consider a child's legal father to be the man who is married to the mother at the date of the child's birth. Well, this fundamental rule reflects the ancient Roman principle pater est quem nuptia demonstrant, and it means that the child is assumed to descend from the mother's husband. Moreover, this presumption also applies 300 days after the dissolution of the marriage. And by the way, 300 days is an average duration of pregnancy. It means that mother's husband will still be considered the father if the child is born within that time, as after the dissolution of the marriage. In Switzerland and in Germany, this period only applies if the dissolution of marriage is caused by the death of the husband, while in Poland, it also includes the time after the divorce. The Polish solution seems to be questionable because a divorce is only possible in the case of complete and permanent breakdown of marriage. This usually takes place long before a spouse decided to file for divorce. Well, besides, the duration of the divorce procedure itself is often very long and longer than the period of pregnancy. So we can see that such extension is far from reality and can cause problems. Well, now back to the presumption itself. The legal dogma I presented to you that the child's father is the mother husband is not limited to Europe. It is well known and widely used all over the world. This slide shows examples of the other countries where this principle applies, including your country, South Korea. And it's interesting to note that this approach doesn't always come directly from the statutory law, but has been created by case law, as for example in China. They didn't have the statutory presumption. They have the new civil code came into force last year, but they didn't create this in the civil code they have created by the case law. What are the legal tools that can be used to deal with these problems? In the standard legal system, in Germany, Poland, and Switzerland, the only way to challenge and reconnect the legal and biological bonds is to challenge the paternity before a court. However, in situations when it's clear that the husband cannot be the biological father, it is not understandable for all persons involved why they have to settle this issue in court. In practice, it applies above all when husband's paternity is unlikely. For example, when the spouses have lived apart for a long time, or the husband is incapable of procreation. Well, in such obvious situation, the parties cannot comprehend why they have to rely on a time-consuming and cost-intensive legal procedure. In this context, it is worth considering solutions proposed by the German expert group. You can see it on my slide. According to their proposal, if all the involved parties agree, and by the involved parties, I mean the mother, her husband, and the biological father, if they agree, then they should be free to change the statutory presumption of paternity outside of the courtroom. Such a change could be done by the freeway consensual declaration, even before the birth of the child. With the parental exchange of the legal father, the best interest of the child is not endangered. I believe that this flexibility is very much in line with the needs of today's society. So I'm interested about your opinion, and maybe you can see your point of view during our discussion. So we'll be very happy about it. However, the childbirth itself can also influence the decision-making process. That is why the German experts have gone even further and proposed to allow recognition on the basis of the consensual declaration also after the birth of the child. But according to them, according to this proposal, this should be possible only within 8 weeks after birth. Again, in my opinion, in principle, a postnatal recognition is to be welcomed, but remains open what period of time should be made available for this form of paternity acknowledgement. The best interest of the child should be here discussed and analyzed. Well, are there other restrictions? The other question is, are there other restrictions that have to be taken into consideration in this approach? Actually, yes. This form of paternity recognition must be seen as an exception rather than a rule. Therefore, modification of the statutory presumption in this way should be allowed only one time. A renewed application of this solution would undermine legal certainty and stability of family relationships, and should therefore be rejected because it would be not in line with the best interest of the child. I have been talking about the possible solution for the future. This is just a draft proposal in Germany when all parties agree about the paternity. But let's come back to the current state of affairs. Actually, child affiliation is determined by the marital status of the mother. So if she is not married, paternity can be established by acknowledgement with mother's consent or by the court decision. But these options are available if the child is born in marriage. It's not available. In such a case, of the statutory presumption applies, and this can only be challenged in court. So the application of these two options is limited and only possible if the child is born outside the marriage. Well, let's have a closer look at who can contest the legal paternity and under what circumstances. Well, in Polish and German system, the entitled person include the child, the mother, and the legal father. Surprisingly, the Swiss law denies the mother this right, and the child's right to contest legal paternity is only possible if the parents start living apart while the child is still a minor. We may ask ourselves, why such a solution? Why mother cannot contest the paternity, for example? What lies behind it? Well, it can be easily explained. The mother was excluded from the circle of entitled persons because Swiss legislator decided that her infidelity, which is a moral reprehensive conduct, would not give her any advantage. So she can't have the right to intervene in family life by depriving her husband of paternity. And when it's come to the child, the Swiss law gives priority to the unity of the family life and the parents' marriage. Therefore, if the family functions normally and fulfills its role, the child cannot challenge the statutory presumption. So that's quite different approach when you have in comparison to Poland or Germany. This is a rather conservative approach, yeah, and in itself not very effective, as it doesn't really protect existing family bonds. It is also not clear why the child's right to challenge paternity should depend on the family situation on which it is no influence. So the child has no influence on the situation, and his legal status depends on the situation in which she cannot influence. So the adopted solution in Switzerland results in an unequal treatment and are broadly criticized by scholars. I hope it will be changed by the next reform. So it's only the question of time. Okay, and now how about the biological father? Why is he not listed among the entitled persons? His legal situation is much more complicated and differs in the studied jurisdictions. Neither Swiss nor Polish law grants the biological father of a child the right to challenge paternity of another man. The frontrunner here is Germany, where such right was granted in 2003. And it is, however, rather limited because the following conditions have to be met. You can see this condition on my slide. So there is no social, so the biological father can contest the presumption when following conditions are met. First, there is no social and family relation between the child and the legal father. And second, the challenging party has to be indeed the biological father. And on the top of this, the alleged biological father has to declare on oath that he had sexual intercourse with the mother during the conception period. Well, this is quite limited, right? But Germany decided to make this decision and to open this challenging of legal paternity also for biological father. Despite giving the biological father the right to challenge the legal paternity, the German law is not fully effective. So it's a lot to be done here. To see the lack of effectiveness, let's take a closer look at the two aspects related to this right: family relation and time limit. So we will focus now on these two issues, family relation and the time limit. When it comes to the first issue, the German law seems to overlook a situation where both a biological and a legal father have contact with the child. Well, we are talking about double social paternity. Let me give you a following example to contextualize this problem. The legal father doesn't live with the mother and the child, but he keeps in touch with the child, pays maintenance, and occasionally visits the child. The biological father, on the other hand, has moved in and take care of the child on a regular basis, and yet the biological father has no right to challenge the paternity. It would be only reasonable. It would also seems reasonable to let him also take the legal responsibility for the child. He moved into the family and take care of the child on the regular daily basis. But the Supreme Court, which reviewed this case, had to decide otherwise, because the German regulation disregards the social bond between the child and its biological father, and gives priority only to the legal father. So the social and family relation is important between the legal father and the child, but the social relation between the biological father and the child is not important when it comes to the German law, when it comes to the possibility of contesting the paternity. Well, such a solution doesn't take into account the well-being of the child and the interest of the biological father. So maybe other scenarios should be considered. Well, in my opinion, I'm interested also, of course, in your opinion, but in my opinion here, the quality of the father-child relationships should be examined in the first place, and this should serve as the basis for the legal responsibility in the case of double paternity. So there's a lot to be done here in the German jurisdiction. Well, the other aspect I wanted to look into is the time limit. The right to challenge paternity is limited in time because the legal status of the child cannot remain insecure indefinitely. Generally speaking, in Germany, an action to challenge paternity has to be taken within 2 years after the entitled person has become aware of circumstances that raise doubts about the child's true paternity. In relation to the legal father, this time requirement seems to be transparent and well balanced. 2 years are enough to consider all the pros and cons and take the rational decision. But the same limitation applies to the biological father. And as we remember from our example, he can't change his legal status as long as social bonds between the child and the legal father exist. So even he is aware of his biological ties to the child, his actions are blocked while the time is running at the same time. So when the 2 years period expires, the biological father can no longer take legal action, even if the relationship between the child and the legal father has broken down. Well, in this respect, German law definitely needs some improvements. In my opinion, during proper social relationship between the child and the legal father, the time limit for challenging paternity should not be pending, should be not pending. And another even better option would be to grant the biological father an independent right to challenge this presumption. Anyway, time limits for challenging paternity are also customary in the other two legal systems and apply to all entitled persons, especially to the mother's husband. Have a short look to Polish legislation. The Polish law has undergone an interesting evolution in this respect and show a small movement in the direction we can change something in this conservative environment. Until recently, the husband had only 6 months for denying his paternity, and interestingly, for him the time limit starts when he gained a knowledge of the child's birth. It was therefore irrelevant when he became aware of the circumstances that made him doubtful about his biological bonds. Consequently, the husband in Poland had a very limited right to deny paternity. This right could only be used if the marriage was broken or there was no sexual intercourse between spouses. But when a child was born to the married couple living together and having normal relationship, questions about the child's paternity were hardly ever asked. The husband was usually trusting and had no reason to file a lawsuit. If the husband became suspicious at all, it was usually too late, as the time limit expired very quickly. The Polish regulation has been criticized by scholars for years, and it was unconstitutional and in breach of the European Convention of Human Rights. We need more time to change the law, but fortunately, 2019, this regulation was finally changed. Now, the mother's husband may bring an action for denial of paternity within 1 year. This time runs from the day he learned that the father, the husband, learns that the child doesn't come from him. However, this action must be brought before the child turns 18. As you can see on my slide, similar regulation applies in Switzerland. Here the husband has also 1 year for legal action, but it can be later than 5 years after the child's birth. This time limitation helps us to protect the stability of the family and protect the child, the interest of the child. Probably this is the reason for this time limitation. Well, our discussion so far has referred to natural conception. Let us now consider what happens in case of assisted reproduction. In Poland, Switzerland, and in Germany, there are some special rules on these issues. Generally speaking, if a child has been conceived by sperm donation and the male partner of the mother has given consent to the insemination, he, as intended father, is not permitted to deny paternity. In such a situation, paternity action against the sperm donors is also excluded. But in Germany, in the case of unmarried couples, the legal situation remains not clear. For example, this is the case when the mother's when the mother's partner, contrary to his earlier stated intention, he changes his mind and refuses to take responsibility for the child after artificial insemination has taken place. This is possible because a consenting man who is not married to the mother doesn't become the legal father by law with the birth of the child. He must recognize the child. This raises a very interesting question. Paternity can be acknowledged before the birth, but can it be acknowledged before conception? In Germany, this question is disputed, but the majority opinion is that it can't. Consequently, the unmarried partner who has given his consent to insemination must acknowledge his paternity after conception. If he doesn't, the child will have no legal father. This is why I think that the legal system should give the opportunity to acknowledge paternity before conception, but only when the future conception refers to a specific insemination. In my opinion, paternity acknowledgement in general is not acceptable. Let us briefly look to the other problem in Germany. You can see it also on my slide. Unlike in Poland and in Switzerland, child conceived through sperm donation can challenge paternity. I think this is a very controversial issue. Imagine the following situation. An adult child, after years of care, challenges the paternity because he or she doesn't want to take care of his old, frail father. This would have, of course, an abuse effect. It seems the problems identified above can be resolved quite easily. Consent to medical assisted procreation should be equal with procreation. The intended father should be thereby treated like a biological father. This would provide a father to an offspring, which is clearly in the best interest of the child. Now, briefly, let me briefly describe the last issue related to the sperm donation. On the one hand, sperm donors usually want to be anonymous. Like blood donors, they only wish to help people in need. On the other hand, every child, even the one who is artificially conceived, has the right to know who his biological father is. Unusually, there is no need to balance some conflicting interests, but in this particular case, the right to know one's genetic origin has priority in all systems examined. To ensure this right, a central sperm donor register was established, and it is then possible for the so-called egg children to find out who their biological fathers are. Sperm donation in Switzerland, a register, for example, more than 400 children are registered in this register. However, as this slide you can follow shows, the right to check one's biological identity was examined only by one person, so it's not very popular here. Okay, the complex legal situation has become even more complicated in Germany, and this is my last issue I would like to address to you. And recently in Switzerland also, of course, because of the same-sex marriage. This brings me to the last part of my talk. The shift in family law may also affect the legal position of the biological father. This is because the so-called marriage for all means that the other parental position can be filled not only by the man as a father, but also by the woman as a co-mother. Some scholars express an opinion that the paternity regulation is in urgent need of change due to the recognition of reorganization and recognition of the same-sex marriage. A non-discriminatory solution is needed, which would express the equal of all spouses in their position as the legal parents. According to this view, every male and also female person who is married to the mother at the time of birth of the child should become other legal parent by operation of law. So the sexuality shouldn't be play any role here. As a result, the co-mother by marriage would be preferred to the biological father in taking over the parental responsibility and parental position. However, this legal privileged occupation of the father position by the co-mother triggers many controversies. Traditionally, the legal connection between the child and the mother's husband is based on the presumption of biological descent. A similar presumption in the case of the co-mother is out of the question. The mother cannot offer the sperm donation here. So after all, it is also not possible for the child to descend from the co-mother. On the other hand, the extension of the presumption of paternity to the co-mother would be a next step in the equal treatment all of married couples. In same-sex marriages, this would also give the child a second parent immediately after birth and save time-consuming adoption. However, Germany has not decided to go that direction so far. In the case of medical assisted reproduction and procreation, on the other hand, putting paternity on equal level with co-maternity doesn't raise any concerns. This is because from the very beginning, in the case of both opposite sex and the same-sex marriages, it is not a question of the genetic but intended parenthood. The sperm donor renounces his parenthood and has no right to challenge why the intended parents contributed significantly to the procreation of the child. This solution, which is only intended for female married couples, is hardly transferable to male married couples, and consequently legal treatment of all parents is also not possible here. It's very questionable and difficult. The co-father, that is the father husband, can oust the woman given birth from her legal role as a mother. Therefore, a simple extension of the marital presumption of paternity to same-sex marriages encounters difficulties of legal and biological nature. In my opinion, a legal presumption that completely disregards biological links and collides with other principles is difficult to accept. I therefore think that the co-mother should be granted legal parenthood only in case of medical assisted reproduction. Well, it will be interesting to see which ways Switzerland chooses to go. There are, of course, many options and even more far-reaching solutions than Germany has proposed so far in this by this expert group. Maybe it's time to completely abandon of the old and today not really helpful legal dogma that the child's father is the mother's husband. Maybe just we should give up this presumption. The statutory presumption could be then replaced by the universal and sex-neutral concept of intended parenthood. Now, intended parenthood is a conception developed a couple of years ago. It's nothing new, but would be still considering in Switzerland to be the model rule for the and should be adopted in the civil code in Switzerland. In practice, this means that each intended parent would have to recognize the child. Such an approach could have additional psychological value and would offer greater flexibility for the child's affiliation. In any case, we have to be aware of far-reaching changes coming in this area in near future. Well, dear colleagues, to sum up, the legal status of the biological father has been undergoing changes. Originally defined very narrowly by the legislator, it is slowly being expanded. However, there is still a lot to be done in this respect. As you could see, many problems need to be solved. Within this short presentation, I could only share a small portion of this complex topic with you, and I would be pleased if I succeed in making the need for the reform clear to you. Well, to finish my speech, it is often said that lawyers have tendency to make life more complicated than it really is. I would like to quote here my teacher and mentor from Vienna, Professor Bedliński. One day, after reading a long and sophisticated legal work, he said, Now I'm even more confused, but on a higher level. I can only hope that my presentation today has not had the same effect on you. Thank you very much for your patience and for your invitation.